Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney.
The real outperformance has been the U.S. corporate high yield.
Are the companies lean enough? Have they trimmed all the fat?
The semiconductor business is a really cyclical business.
Breaking market headlines and corporate news from across the globe.
Do investors like the M&A that we've seen?
These are two big-time blue-chip companies.
The window between the peak and cut changing super fast.
Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
On today's Bloomberg Intelligence show, we dig inside the big business stories impacting Wall Street and the global markets.
Each and every week, we provide in-depth research and data on some of the 2,000 companies and 130 industries our analysts cover worldwide.
Today, we'll look at why Boeing is predicting a massive cash drain.
Plus, we'll discuss how high power costs are impacting the European economy.
But first, we dive into consumer products and ice cream.
Ooh, yeah. Earlier in the week, Unilever said it plans to separate its ice cream business and cut 7,500 jobs. This comes as the company seeks to boost profits and jumpstart sluggish growth in the UK.
For more, guest host Molly Smith and I were joined by Bloomberg Intelligence analysts Deborah Aiken and Duncan Fox.
Deborah is senior analyst for global luxury goods, and Duncan Fox is a consumer products analyst.
I first asked Duncan for more context on what's going on with Unilever.
I think if you go back 2 years, they thought about it then when they sort of pushed it into 5 divisions, and it was thought that they may sell it off or IPO it. So it's really coming back to the table. I think it was impossible back in 22 because you had food inflation going off the charts. So I don't think anybody would have dared to do anything with it. But it's a business that is very capital intensive. They've got an excellent market share, 20%, so they're a global leader by some way. But it's one that I suppose if you want to refocus Unilever as a whole, it's a low margin business when you look at it against the HPC business. So I can see why they would consider either selling or IPOing the business. It does make sense.
Hey, Deb, so you've been following the retail space for a while. What do you make of all this?
I think we can go back to the big offer that Unilever had, and the way that since then, over the last few years, they've had a couple of CEOs that just haven't done what the market had hoped. There's always been a wonder over whether beauty and personal care actually fitted with food and refreshments. And I think the market probably expects, Duncan and I were just talking, that nutrition would be the next to go actually, but they can't both go at the same time. So it really does make sense because you're left with businesses which quickly, they say end of 2025, so it's typical, a little bit slow churn from Unilever in the way that they operate, but under the new CEO, Heinz Schumacher, combined with Trian's Nelson Peltz on the board, and the way that he turned around P&G, Mondelez and others, that we would expect to see this business return to hopefully the top end of its 3 to 5% organic sales growth and to high teens digit adjusted operating margin, which is where they used to focus until a few years ago, until that inflation came in and until they just couldn't pass it through in developed markets. They do much better in developing.
So, Duncan, talk to us about the ice cream business. Is it a good business?
Well, I think so. I mean, you can't beat a Magnum when you're on the way home. But as I say, it is the global leader pretty much in every geography. I think it's only number 2 in Latin America. So they have leadership. And you said it's capital intensive because about half of that global, I think it's about an $87 billion business globally. And half of that is through food service or impulse buying. So that's why you've got to get everything right on the distribution. And on the whole, it looks like Unilever are holding or gaining market share in most of the regions. So they're running it well. But it does come down to innovation and actually that distribution. We've just got to get it right, making sure that we can buy, particularly impulse, that product when you want it on the way home, generally. So it can be a bit weather dependent, and that's what makes it tricky, I think, to sell. Because if you're the leader, you're there to be shot at. So they've got to make sure they keep investing. Current management team seems to be doing that. So good business. So I think an IPO seems the most sensible way to go forward, to be fair.
I mean, personally, I would say ice cream is a year-round treat,
Exactly.
but maybe that's just
I
me.
agree with you totally. But it tends to start at Easter, would you believe? So, 2 weeks' time is the start of the season.
Well, so
Strangely.
we're getting into high season for ice cream, one might say. I mean, the flip side of all this, though, is the job cuts, looking at about 7,500, a lot of those in middle management. I mean, how many companies have we seen that's really where so many of the job cuts are targeted at? Can you tell us a little bit about that, Deb, and the productivity gains that Unilever is looking to get from these job cuts?
Yeah, I think in October, Unilever did highlight that they had a growth action plan. And part of that was to drive top line and to really look at how they were implementing their productivity gains. So already ahead of this announcement on ice cream, there's been a new strategic group in place, making lots of change, not just in ice cream, but across the 4 other businesses, but particularly ice cream and refreshments, when they separated from 3 business units over to 5 in 2022. Ice cream in terms of profitability, and also actually home care, which they have there for now and which they need to do much with the 2 lowest margin areas. So in terms of what they're doing and the way forward, I think that we see that productivity savings, they had a 1% savings project, 1% sales as a project, cost savings project in place. They say that they will drive 800 million of savings for 1.2% productivity on the cost side of sales over 3 years. I worked that out on MODL to come in at around 0.4 billion net positive, but over a 3-year period. And on the back of that, actually, I think there'll be more savings to be had, but a deeper disposal plan across the 4 other businesses too.
Our thanks to Bloomberg Intelligence analysts Deb Aiken and Duncan Fox.
We move now to weight loss drugs. It looks as if the drug makers Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly have a powerful new ally as they conquer the $80 billion obesity shot market. And that ally is former Weight Watchers spokeswoman Oprah Winfrey.
Winfrey recently appeared on an ABC special with executives from Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly. For more on what all of this means, guest host Molly Smith and I were joined by Madison Muller, Bloomberg News health reporter. We first asked, what's Oprah's role here with these drug makers?
We're used to seeing Oprah as the face of Weight Watchers,
yes,
obviously, for the last almost a decade. And she said recently that she was exiting the board of Weight Watchers. And then she said that it was to avoid potential perceptions of conflict of interest. And then she's doing this special now, which was all about weight loss drugs.
So she did a special on ABC television?
Yeah, on ABC.
Was it a paid promotion or
it was not. Novo Nordisk said that they didn't have any, financial anything to do with Oprah really, and she's not, to our knowledge, doesn't have a partnership with either of the drug manufacturers. But people that were watching the show and were on Twitter sort of reacting to it said that it watched and seemed sort of like an infomercial for the drugs.
Weird.
Yeah, tell us a little bit more about who was on it. You were telling us that there were some doctors, but maybe they kind of glanced over the side effects a bit, and that this was really just a big, hype up moment for these weight loss drugs.
Yeah, so they heard from patients, there were doctors, there were executives from Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly on the program as well. The majority of the program was sort of centered on patient experiences with these drugs, but it really didn't get into details about the side effects, sort of glossed over them, and the doctor that they had on talking about them said that the side effects were overhyped.
Really? So again, that kind of goes to the editorial integrity of it. I mean, I'm not a journalist, but...
Really?
Yeah, I mean...
Aren't we all journalists in the room?
I guess. I don't know.
There was definitely, I think that it served a purpose, and Oprah is on these drugs. She's had a great experience with them, so she says, and that's sort of what the program was centered around, and really spoke to that positive experience on the drugs.
So what are Oprah's feelings toward Weight Watchers right now? I mean, this, like you said, she has been the face of that company for so many years, and now just really seems to be doing a total 180, and that Weight Watchers would probably be on the losing end of the success of these drugs.
Yeah, and she asked, Weight Watchers CEO was on this program, and she asked a very pointed question, what is the role and what's the point of Weight Watchers now that we have these medications, which I think is sort of the question that the whole industry has been asking, and the diet industry and analysts and everyone. And Weight Watchers CEO said that there is still a role for them to play in supporting the community, supporting people's weight loss journeys, but I guess that still sort of remains to be seen.
I really hesitate to ask this question, but since you reported on it, what is Ozempic face?
Yes. So Ozempic face is another sort of trend that we're seeing happen right now, especially here in New York. People who have rapid weight loss from the weight loss drugs are getting this hollowed out look in their cheeks, which, I mean, it happens with weight loss. It's not just from the drugs, but it's the rapid weight loss that sort of makes it more noticeable. So then they're seeking out plastic surgery clinics, med spas to get Botox or facelifts and sort of help offset those effects.
Add that to the list of all of the winners and losers of what comes out of Ozempic. I mean, the original kind of knock-on effect was like, oh, all the potato chip companies, like maybe not so good for them, and now plastic surgery coming up. So
exactly.
It's just like the hollowing out of your face. So you've got the saggy skin there, and
like the extra loose skin.
Okay.
I mean, AbbVie, which makes Botox, has said that this could be a potential boon for Botox sales going forward. They said that at earnings last quarter. So it's like
I can't keep up.
Yeah.
So on these GLP drugs, where are we in terms of, I know someone who has a prescription, but this person cannot get it filled because there's not enough supply. Where, and it is not me. Where are we?
Also not insured. Right? Mostly?
Yeah, so that two questions.
Yeah.
Where are we on ramping up supply to meet demand? And then secondarily, who pays for this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, the supply problem has been a huge issue, and Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly are investing billions of dollars to ramp up supply to try to meet demand. But, I've seen in analyst notes, they're like, the demand for these products just seems like it's insatiable. Yeah. And at this point, they're already coming from behind. So, and all of these investments in production capacity, take a couple of years to come online. So we're sort of just still racing to keep up with it. It's, probably, Lilly said it's probably going to be, not this year that they're able to meet supply, maybe next year.
Wow.
So we're still trying to ramp up the supply there. And then in terms of paying for it, we have I think 50% of commercial plans cover the drugs for obesity. A third of state health plans through Medicaid cover the drugs. Medicare does not cover weight loss drugs. So it's very patchy still, and a lot of people are paying out of pocket.
Our thanks to Madison Muller, Bloomberg News health reporter.
All right, coming up, we're going to break down why Boeing is predicting a massive cash drain.
You're listening to Bloomberg Intelligence on Bloomberg Radio, providing in-depth research and data on 2,000 companies and 130 industries. You can access Bloomberg Intelligence via BI Go on the terminal. I'm Paul Sweeney.
And I'm Alex Steele, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Move next to the aerospace industry and Boeing. This week, Boeing predicted a massive cash drain for the first quarter.
Boeing Chief Financial Officer Brian West said cash outflow will reach $4 billion to $4.5 billion in the first quarter. Analysts had expected $5 billion.
So the outlook reflects a shift in priorities over at Boeing. The company is grappling with the aftermath of a near catastrophic fuselage failure on a 737 MAX 9 aircraft earlier this year.
For more on all of this, we were joined by George Ferguson, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Aerospace, Defense, and Airlines Analyst. We first asked George for context on what's going on at Boeing.
Well, I mean, I think we heard it from Brian West. besides, I think, the cash flow guidance he provided few details about anything else. And so he describes a lot of processes, processes at the FAA to get airplanes certified, processes in refining the manufacturing process, curing, the excess outsourcing they've probably done over the last couple decades. I think what you really get is a sense of a company that's in a state of a lot of flux. The market likes the fact that he talked about cash flow being positive by the end of the year. So it sounds like they've got a pretty nice ramp up in sort of resuming build rates at their factories across the year. That was better than what I expected. But again, the storyline inside the company is still one that's all about flux and not about details. So I just wonder, I think I got a sense there's some risk in that cash flow projection.
Yeah. So, George, you've covered Boeing for decades here. Can you recall a time when maybe they've had these quality issues before? How unprecedented is these, last couple of years, really?
I think thoroughly unprecedented, right? So Even as I was leaving BlackRock, during the global financial crisis, I remember Boeing stock was down at $33 a share, pretty cheap than what it is today. The discussion then was just about like a defense portfolio whose products really weren't that modern, and angst about the company's future, but not these kind of problems inside their manufacturing business, which is the core business of this company, right? Mm-hmm. It's an engineering and manufacturing company. If you can't manufacture things well in aerospace, that's a bad sign. So I don't think it's ever been this bad, ever.
So just to recap, at a Bank of America conference in London, the CFO said the cash outflow is going to reach $4 to $4.5 billion in the first quarter. Yep. Analysts were looking for maybe $5 billion plus, and like you said, that maybe we'll get cash flow positive by the end of the year. That was the indication from Boeing. Do we believe? Okay, that's not the right question. How did they come up with this estimate? Like, what are the factors that go into this kind of estimate?
That's exactly, we don't know, right? And so some of the,
it's
all about deliveries. It's all about deliveries of commercial airplanes. I heard what I thought was we're going to be at rate 38 by the end of the year, which is the rate they should have probably built at all year long. And then we'll move to the next higher rate, that's 38 a month, on the 737. And we'll move to the next higher rate when the FAA lets us. So our view at Bloomberg Intelligence of what we think build rates were, I can tell you we have factored in a fourth quarter at rate 38, but it sounds like quarter one's going to be a really rough quarter, so they'll have to pull a lot of things back together to get rate back to 38 by the end of the year. But I think it
feels like everything has
feasible.
To go right.
Yeah.
For that to happen, Paul. And as we know, that never happens.
That never happens. But George, you've told us in the past, in the aerospace business, there is no, hey, we did a pretty good job on this plane. It has to be perfect every single time. Otherwise, it's disastrous. And they've, from their customer's perspective, George, if I'm a big buyer like a Southwest or a United, what am I saying to these guys? I mean, I fly thousands of these planes every single day in my fleet. What am I telling Boeing these days?
Yeah, so you're watching very, very closely. Of course, you're telling Boeing that quality is job one, safety quality is job one. But especially if you're like a Southwest or a Ryanair, where you're a pure fleet, right? You really can't afford your most important supplier to have problems like this. So I think you're quietly coaching them to improve things, hoping for better, but you're probably biting your nails a little bit, right? Because if there's it continues to be serious problems, you're not switching to Airbus, overnight. And I don't know that those people are considering it. I'm not saying that they are, but you got to be concerned. You got to be watching very closely.
George, let's talk about the other half of your research coverage, which is the airlines themselves. I just flew Newark to Salt Lake City, 737 MAX 8, fully packed to the gills both ways. How are the airlines doing these days?
Yeah, so in 1Q, I think a bunch of them are going to show losses. So they're filling airplanes because I think the revenue managers never let airplanes go down the runway with almost, being entirely full. But what counts is, the most is going to be the ticket prices. And, when we looked at 4Q, as we closed out of 4Q, the biggest challenge to the higher revenue that they were bringing in was all about these higher pilot salaries, right? They gave a bunch away to the pilots. And so while we're all paying more for the ticket, the pilot's getting more in the front seat. They probably deserve it. They work pretty hard.
I want my pilots to be happy.
True story.
You do, actually. So profitability is still challenged compared to what we saw last decade. I think fares would have to go even higher, and we've seen them softening a bit. This summer could be a little bit better for the airlines if we have a bunch of Airbus A320s out of the market because of the geared turbofan problems, if Boeing deliveries are slowing down capacity gains in the marketplace, it could be a little bit better, but we're not looking at an environment where we think they're going to see 2019 levels of profitability, not 2019, even last decade levels of profitability this summer. So I'd say profits still a little bit weak as the airlines recover. I think there might be just too much capacity in the marketplace.
Our thanks to George Ferguson, Bloomberg Intelligence, Senior Aerospace, Defense, and Airlines Analyst.
We move next to the chip space. This week, the U.S. Commerce Department announced that it will award the tech company Intel $8.5 billion in grants and as much as $11 billion in loans. It's a preliminary agreement to help fund an expansion of Intel semiconductor factories.
Intel is the first company to land a funding deal from the 2022 CHIPS and Science Act for advanced chip-making facilities. The CHIPS Act set aside billions in grants to persuade chip companies to build factories on American soil.
For more on this, we were joined by Mackenzie Hawkins, a Bloomberg News U.S. industrial reporter, and we first asked for some context here on the Intel story.
Biden signed the CHIPS Act into law in August 2022. Companies have been waiting for well over a year to see those funds start flowing out the door. They haven't actually flowed out the door yet. Intel's award's just a preliminary agreement, and it will be likely until the end of this year that they start to actually see money doled out in tranches. But this is a huge investment in, the real leading American chip maker. And I mean, these chips will power, the AI frenzy. They're the types of chips that go into nuclear missiles and hypersonics. So this is a really significant investment for the company and for the states where they're building, including Arizona, Ohio, Oregon, and New Mexico.
So, okay, I love covering energy, so I'm really into the IRA. And like what we've seen a lot in the IRA is everyone got super excited, but then actually sort of putting shovels in the ground was a lot more difficult. So there's like, yeah, we're going to get the money. It's going to happen, but it's not happening quite yet. How do we think this plays out from the CHIPS Act? Like, when does Intel put a shovel in the ground? What other companies are trying to put their shovels in the ground and get the funding? And will it actually, happen?
So Intel's already building these facilities. They've had a $20 billion Arizona expansion underway for some time. They're building multiple fabrication facilities there. They're making some progress in Ohio, although there's been reporting that that's slightly delayed. We expect that construction to finish in 2026. Intel's rivals, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company and Samsung out of South Korea, are also building plants in the U.S. Both of their sites have seen some delays that the companies and the Biden administration insist are in line with typical projections. But time will tell on this one. It will be years before these facilities are stood up. The Commerce Department has set a goal that the U.S. will produce 20% of the world's advanced logic chips by the end of the decade. Currently, we're at about 0. So that's a lot of progress to catch up on. Most of that production is happening in East Asia. The companies announced their projects before they got the funding from the federal government, but it is certainly their expectation that they will receive that funding, and they would like it to happen, probably a little bit faster than it is.
Hey, Mackenzie, how secure is this funding over time? I'm thinking about we may have a new administration in 2025. How secure is this funding, and particularly in the out years?
It's a great question. So there's a due diligence stage and then a final term sheet between Intel and the Commerce Department that will likely come closer to the time of the presidential election. And the Commerce Department is setting all types of benchmarks that Intel must meet for the money to be doled out over time. So it's not that they get the final agreement and then they get $8.5 billion in grants and $11 billion worth of loan guarantees. They have to meet benchmarks related to production, related to workforce development, and there are all types of requirements that Biden's Commerce Department might set that a potential Trump Commerce Department might not be as interested in. You've seen things like childcare facilities, which Intel and other companies have committed to, community development agreements, all those types of things. It's entirely possible that that could shift over time. But the reality is, once they've got the equipment in the building, these are machines that cost hundreds of millions of dollars, they're committed to these facilities. But Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger said we might need a CHIPS Act 2.0. These companies are vying for a lot more money than they currently have. The advanced chip makers together asked for more than double what the Commerce Department has available. So this is really something to watch over the next couple of years and decades.
I mean, is President Trump really going to go to Ohio and Arizona and Oregon and New Mexico and be like, just kidding, I'm going to take this development back? I mean, I think that's going to be a tricky proposition, considering it is so much money. So I just came back, Mackenzie, from an energy conference, basically, and I was just telling Paul that all the talk there was that tech companies are finally getting wise to the fact that they're going to build all this stuff. They need power, and that power isn't as easy to come by as they might have thought. Do you hear that at all on your industrial side? Like, hey, this is great, build all these data centers, Intel, but like, how are you going to get that power? What are you plugging in?
Absolutely, infrastructure is a top concern for these companies. A big part of their ability to apply for CHIPS Act funding is to demonstrate commercial viability and that they have buy-in from state and local officials to marshal the resources necessary to stand-up factories that cost tens of billions of dollars to build sometimes require entire new water pipelines or energy resources. Take Arizona, which has not just this massive Intel expansion, but also a huge factory, 2 factories under construction from TSMC. Arizona does 100-year water planning. This is a desert. Wow. And so they've had to very carefully plan their water development, ensure residents that their water supply is not going to be impacted. And down to the land parcel in Arizona, they've planned these industrial parks. You see similar things happening in Indiana, which is expected to get a roughly $15 billion investment from SK Hynix, which is one of the main advanced packaging companies out of South Korea. That announcement hasn't been formally announced yet, but Bloomberg has reported on it. So, this is a massive infrastructural effort, which, as you note, is coming alongside a lot of other investments in other sectors stemming from the Inflation Reduction Act, things like EVs, batteries, hydrogen, wind, solar, and sort of more traditional hard infrastructure from the bipartisan infrastructure law.
Our thanks to Mackenzie Hawkins, Bloomberg News U.S. industrial reporter.
Coming up on the program, a conversation with Jim Fitterling, CEO of the Dow Chemical Company, on consumer demand and power prices over in Europe.
You're listening to Bloomberg Intelligence on Bloomberg Radio, providing in-depth research and data on 2,000 companies in 130 industries. You can access Bloomberg Intelligence via BI Go on the terminal. I'm Paul Sweeney.
And I'm Alex Steele, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We move next to social media and TikTok, and many U.S. citizens are questioning whether they'll be able to use the app going forward.
A swift passage of a House bill last week would force a sale of TikTok or ban the app in the U.S. The bill would next have to pass through the U.S. Senate.
And this comes as U.S. officials have argued that the Chinese government's relationship with TikTok's parent company ByteDance raises national security risks.
Earlier in the week, guest host John Tucker and I were joined by Matthew Schuttenhelm, Bloomberg Intelligence media litigation analyst. We first asked him what's the holdup with the bill in the U.S. Senate.
It's amazing to see the bipartisan support this has. You don't see legislation move 352 to 65 like we saw last week in the House. You've seen senators on both sides say they want this. You've seen Chuck Schumer in the past, the Senate Majority Leader, say he likes the idea of requiring a change in ownership of TikTok. So that's exactly the question now. I think the holdup, though, is look, this is an election year. And even though you've seen President Biden say, look, get it, if it comes to my desk, I'll sign it. He also has 150 million Americans using this app, many of them young people. At a time when you have an election coming in November, when every vote matters, in particular young people, to President Biden. So I think this legislation has a chance. I only give it a 30% chance, though, this year. And that's exactly because of the political risks of November at a time when President Biden doesn't want to risk a potential backlash from those young voters. The Senate is controlled by Democrats. Senator Chuck Schumer is the majority leader. He decides how quickly this moves. And I think the looming election is a reason to move slowly. But after that, after this election is out of the way, I'd be a little more nervous if I were TikTok.
So do we have any clear sense of what TikTok and ByteDance, how they're approaching this at this point? Like, what would they presumably do?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think we've seen indications from China that it would not be willing to support a divestiture. Now, that could be posturing on that end, but I think there's the possibility that if the U.S. passes this legislation that requires a divestiture or else there's an effective ban, there's a real possibility that China wouldn't allow any sort of divestiture like that to happen. So you're inevitably in the result of a ban. Of course, you're also in courts as soon as Congress passes this, and you saw Montana passed the TikTok ban last year. It got tripped up in court. You saw President Trump, before he was against this, he actually signed a ban of TikTok. That was tripped up in the court. So once this passes, you still have a tough court challenge coming. And so TikTok's first line of defense is going to be to sue over this.
All right. So if this ultimately goes to the courts, you got to explain to me, what's the legitimate national security threat of me posting pictures of myself or video of myself, redoing my bathroom, or Lisa putting on her mascara?
That's exactly the question the courts are going to be asking. And the House went into closed session in committee when it talked about this. So they were secret on the concerns that motivated this. But then after they had that closed session, all of a sudden it was 50-0 voting in support. So we don't exactly know. I think the concern is that if this data is, not just you looking at your, cat videos or whatever it is, but 150 million Americans, everything that they are looking at, all of this flow of data going to China, lets China take a look at it. There's also a concern on the propaganda side that if China can impact sort of the flow of videos, can they start to shape thinking? And in particular in young people. There's two sides of the concern here, looking at the data about how we're using it, and also influencing thought potentially by framing messages, by using an algorithm to promote certain ideas.
Our thanks to Matt Sheltonhelm, Bloomberg Intelligence media litigation analyst.
So, Paul, earlier this week, I was in Houston, and I was joined by Jim Fitterling, CEO of the Dow Chemical Company, and he talked about consumer demand in U.S. and Europe, and he told me that the high price of electricity in Europe is hurting customers, consumers, and the European economy. In the U.S., though, very different story. And I began this portion of our conversation by asking Jim if the U.S. economy actually needs the Fed to cut interest rates this year.
It's starting to feel like the economy is gaining a little bit of strength at the beginning of the year. It's not robust. Maybe a little bit early to tell if this is a long-term trend, but it's been a decent start to the year. Electronics has been a bit stronger than last year. Last year was a kind of a weak spot, so our outlook is good. Automotive had a good year last year, and I think despite the discussion around electric vehicles and some of the flat to negative sentiment that's in the news, the reality is I think it's going to be another good year in the automotive sector. Housing's been the slow start, but there's been an uptick in single-family home starts, which is good. That usually has a ripple effect through a lot of other durable goods manufacturing. We haven't seen that yet. So a modest, good start to the year, and we just see how things develop.
So we're getting there. So that begs the question that if we do, say, get 2 to 3 cuts this year, for example, from the Fed, is your expectation that we see accelerated growth, higher inflation? Like, does that actually start more growth?
Well, I think in the commodity space, and in our industry in particular, we tend to lead into a slowdown. And so we started to lead into this 18 months, middle of this year will be 24 months ago. And we typically tend to lead out. And so it's too early to say we're coming out, but you can start to see shoots that are like when we see a recovery. And of course, that demand, what's missing from the economy right now is the durable goods demand, and construction demand. And when that comes back, those are high volume applications, and that demand pull is going to mean that prices are going to move up a bit. I don't know if I would call that necessarily inflationary, but that's just the cycle.
What do you think it's waiting for?
I think it's waiting for rate reductions for the mortgage rates to come down. I think that's the next big thing that typically triggers a kind of a shoot up in the housing market. And then that triggers a lot of other services and durable goods demand that comes behind it.
So we may see a second half recovery.
I'm hopeful.
That's sort of what I'm hearing from you.
I'm hopeful, yeah.
Is it a similar picture over in Europe? So the chemical sector in Europe is under a lot of pressure. I mean, input costs are high. The economy there is weaker in many sense compared to the U.S. What's your take?
European consumer demand is not nearly as strong as it is here in the States. And of course, the weight of higher energy costs has hit the consumer in a lot of different ways. Now we're seeing an improvement year over year. Obviously, energy's come down, but electricity, which most consumers purchase, electricity costs are double, maybe a little bit more than what they are here in the U.S. So I think, there's a big question. When I look at my downstream customers in Europe, I'm always questioning how long will they be there? And if you don't have a domestic market to service in Europe, you really can't afford to export from Europe. So if you don't have a domestic market to service, you have to say, what does my footprint need to be? How long can I be there in order to be part of that economy?
That's a big deal. I mean, you're talking about the automotive industry, construction industry. Like, is that going to move? What's your best sense?
A lot of technology comes out of there too. I mean, beyond just the industry, a lot of the technology that we use around the world starts in Europe. And so, exporting technology obviously is a little bit easier than exporting product. But we're already starting to see imports of electric vehicles from China into Europe. We're seeing China has become a lower cost competitor than Europe in petrochemicals, so you're starting to see product move into Europe. The Middle East obviously has been a big supplier because of their cost position into Europe. Europe's getting a bit of a reprieve right now because of the Suez Canal situation, so operating rates are up a little bit. But I think once that Israel-Gaza conflict is resolved, then we'll see things go back to normal.
Is it fair to say that you wouldn't build a new chemical plant in Europe right now?
Be very tough. You'd have to be in a very specialized downstream market that you knew could handle the higher input costs. But I would say in general, it'd be very tough.
So for you then, let's take a look at inflation for a second. Where are costs still rising and where are they falling?
You're starting to see some costs. I mean, costs in commodities came off pretty dramatically. I think one of the reasons we announced our final investment decision on our project in Canada at the end of last year was because we were able to lock in a lot of bulk material costs like steel, concrete, cement, all the things we need to build a plant. So I think that's been good. Now, obviously, as some of this construction demand and things come back, that'll tend to rise with the cycle. But I think if you looked at the commodity portion, a lot of inflation came out of there. If you look at the consumer, like going to the grocery store, some of that hasn't come out yet. And so I think we're starting to see that with the destocking that happened last year, no signs of really restocking in the value chain. I think you're going to start to see some of that consumer inflation come out too. And I think that's a little bit what the Fed's looking at.
Are you worried about tariffs come, I don't know, November, January, from either president?
As a global company and as a company that's been part of global trade for many, many years, tariffs don't stimulate demand anywhere. So I think what would happen under a tariff regime is we might not be happy with the demand result. Global free trade has been a better platform for growth. It's been better for growth, not just for the U.S., and we're advantaged, of course, because of energy, among other things, but it's been great for other countries. It's lifted so many people out of poverty. It's created a middle class. It's allowed technology to transfer around the world. So
it would also just mean that you would have to produce and use the products in country, right? You have to produce and do in country. It would be totally separate from each other.
Right. When we have a supply chain today that is not U.S.-centric and hasn't had time to reshore, so that would become inflationary in and of itself. So I think, the thing we're trying to fight and the tool we're using, they both could end up being inflationary. I don't know that tariffs is the answer.
Let's turn to, if you're building a new plant today, what are you going to power it with in the next 10 to 15 years? Like, what's going to be that thing?
Well, we are building a new plant in Canada, and the purpose for going up there was to build the world's first zero Scope 1 and 2 emissions ethylene complex. We will power it with hydrogen. It's a pretty elegant solution because we actually take ethane and natural gas liquid, we crack it to make ethylene, and we make two byproducts, methane and hydrogen. Linde will come in and build an autothermal reformer that'll convert that to pure hydrogen, and that pure hydrogen will fire the furnace. So it's a very closed-loop system that will allow us to capture all the CO2 off the autothermal reformer and sequester that and make zero Scope 1 and 2 ethylene and plastics there. It'll be the biggest hydrogen carbon capture project of its kind in the world, and it'll be the first one. The first phase will be up in 2027.
Our thanks to Jim Fitterling, CEO of the Dow Chemical Company.
This is the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live each weekday, 10 a.m. to noon Eastern, on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.